Good evening. Welcome to yet another in our series on the Book of Acts. Going to start tonight with a reading of Psalm 104, which is a longer psalm than I usually read before a class, but it touches a bit on what we're going to be talking about tonight, at least in verse 3 of Acts chapter 18, verse 3, which is kind of redundant, I realize. But Psalm 104. I like this psalm because it speaks a lot of nature about nature. Bless the Lord, O my soul. O Lord my God, you are very great. You are clothed with splendor and majesty, covering yourself with light as with a garment, stretching out the heavens like a tent. He lays the beams of his chamber on the waters. He makes the clouds his chariot. He rides on the wings of the wind. He makes his messengers winds and his ministers a flaming fire. He set the earth on its foundations so that it should never be moved. You covered it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At your rebuke they fled. At the sound of your thunder they took to flight. The mountains rose, the valleys sank down to the place that you appointed for them. You set a boundary that they may not pass, so that they might not again cover the earth. You make springs gush forth in the valleys. They flow between the hills. They give drink to every beast of the field. The wild donkeys quench their thirst. Beside them, the birds of the heavens dwell. They sing among the branches. From your lofty abode, you water the mountains. The earth is satisfied with the fruit of your work. You cause the grass to grow for the livestock and plants for man to cultivate, that he may bring forth food from the earth and wine to gladden the heart of man, oil to make his face shine, and bread to strengthen man's heart. The trees of the Lord are watered abundantly, the cedars of Lebanon that he planted. In them the birds build their nests. The stork has her home in the fir trees. The high mountains are for the wild goats. Their rocks are a refuge for the rock badgers. He made the moon to mark the seasons. The sun knows its time for setting. You make darkness, and it is night, when all the beasts of the forest creep about. The young lions roar for their prey, seeking their food from God. When the sun rises, they steal away and lie down in their dens. Man goes out to his work and to his labor until the evening. O Lord, how manifold are your works! In wisdom you have made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. Here is the sea, great and wide, which teems with creatures innumerable, living things both small and great. There go the ships and Leviathan which you formed to play in it. These all look to you to give them their food in due season. When you give it to them, they gather it up. When you open your hand, they are filled with good things. When you hide your face, they are dismayed. When you take away their breath, they die and return to their dust. When you send forth your spirit, they are created, and you renew the face of the ground. May the glory of the Lord endure forever. May the Lord rejoice in his works, who looks on the earth and it trembles, who touches the mountains and they smoke. I will sing to the Lord as long as I live. I will sing praise to my God while I have being. May my meditation be pleasing to him, for I rejoice in the Lord. Let sinners be consumed from the earth, and let the wicked be no more. Bless the Lord, O my soul. Praise the Lord. We are in not Psalm, we're studying Acts. We are in Acts chapter 18. This evening, we're going to be looking at the time that Paul spends in Corinth. I don't know how many weeks it's going to be, probably this week and one other, maybe two others, depending on how deeply we dig into this, because there's a lot to unpack here in these verses. I'm going to read for you, down through down through verse 17 of First Corinthians. I really should have read the script before I started this class. Acts chapter 18, verses 1 through 17, and then we're going to make some comments. If I'm lucky, they will be on the book of Acts. If I'm unlucky, it might be on the book that I'm listening to as I drive back and forth to work, a novel by Tana French. And that wouldn't be conducive to good study. Acts chapter 18, verses 1 through 17. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. He found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. And he went to see them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath, and tried to persuade Jews and Greeks. When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that the Christ was Jesus. And when they opposed him and reviled him, he shook out his garments and said to them, Your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles. And he left there and went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. His house was next door to the synagogue. Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed in the Lord, together with his entire household, and many of the Corinthians, hearing Paul, believed and were baptized. And the Lord said to Paul one night in a vision, Do not be afraid, but go on speaking, and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one will attack you to harm you, for I have many people in this city who are my people. And he stayed a year and 6 months teaching the word of God among them. But when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal, saying, This man is persuading people to worship God contrary to the law. But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, If it were a matter of wrongdoing or vicious crime, O Jews, I would have reason to accept your complaint. But since it is a matter of questions about words and names in your own law, see to it yourselves. I refuse to be a judge of these things. And he drove them from the tribunal. And they all seized Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal. But Gallio paid no attention to any of this. And we're not going to talk about that verse tonight, because that's a really interesting verse. Rather, we're going to look at Paul's arrival in Corinth, his mindset as he is coming there from Athens, and his meeting with Aquila and Priscilla, and beginning to work with them while he's reasoning with the Jews in the synagogue. Because we need to understand the significance of the city of Corinth and what is going on and why perhaps the Spirit has directed him there. And maybe as we are studying Paul's ministry there in Achaia, we need to address the question of why then earlier in chapter 16 did Paul have a vision from a man in Macedonia saying, Come and help us. See, Paul was called to Macedonia, but in Macedonia he met nothing but resistance. In Philippi, he is, after he casts the demon out of the girl who was following them around, proclaiming, Here, these guys are speaking about the way of salvation from the true God. They were asked to leave town a little bit forcefully, but they were jailed and unlawfully, and Paul brings that up to the people who had arrested him and had he and Silas beaten and jailed, and they asked him to leave town. Paul leaves town. He goes over to Thessalonica and has a very short ministry there, maybe less than 6 months as he's there. And the unbelieving Jews, drive him out of town, taking him before they didn't take him, they took the fellow he was staying with, Jason. They dragged him before the authorities, who secured from him he posted bail essentially for as an assurance of Paul's good behavior. And Paul leaves Thessalonica, goes south to Berea, where he meets with great success with the word, But the Jews, the unbelieving Jews from Thessalonica, come down and they stir up a trouble so that the Jews in Berea have to escort Paul out of town, and he finds himself and he ends up in Athens, which is in the province of Achaia. No, he's no longer in Macedonia. And in Athens, he meets with pretty strong resistance. He gets into debating with the philosophers there who bring him before the Areopagus, the high court of Athens, to essentially on the charge of this man is preaching foreign divinities, the same charge that was brought before Socrates and ended up resulting in him committing suicide and killing himself. And Paul uses that as his springboard into saying, hey, as I was looking at your objects of worship, I saw an altar with the inscription to an unknown God or to the unknown God. So what you guys are ignorant about, that's the God I'm proclaiming. Here, let me tell you about him. Not a foreign divinity, but a God that you have been worshiping, though you haven't been worshiping him correctly. He has a few believers. We're told at the end of Acts 17 and verse 34, some men joined him and believed, among whom were Dionysius the Areopagite. So here's a man from the council and a woman named Damaris and others with them. And so there's a small bit of success there in Athens. And he leaves Athens and he goes to Corinth. Why would he go to Corinth? Well, we'll talk about that in just a moment. But what is his mindset? One of the commentators I've been reading, Richard Longnecker, wrote in his commentary that Paul's coming to Corinth was in weakness and fear with much trembling. If you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 3, it's interesting to compare what Paul writes to the Corinthians with what Luke writes here in Acts and see the things that Paul accentuates versus the things that Luke accentuates. And I think Luke is pointing us to the confrontation in front of Gallio for a reason, I believe, and we'll get to that when we actually get there. So 1 Corinthians chapter 2, beginning in verse 1, and when I came to you, brothers, I did not come proclaiming to you the testimony of God with lofty speech or wisdom, for I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. And I was with you in weakness and in fear and much trembling. And the speech and my speech and my message were not implausible words of wisdom, but a demonstration of the Spirit and of power, that your faith might not rest in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. Some commentators look at that and say it was because of his lack of success, and I'm putting that in quotes, in front of the learned men of Athens, that Paul, rather than deciding to preach a lofty speech of wisdom, which is really what the speech before the Areopagus is, Paul is reasoning with them and using their own rhetoric against them to show that there is one true God. He doesn't live in temples. Not worshipped by He's not served by human beings and he's not represented by idols. And he comes down to that conclusion and saying, here's coming a coming day of judgment, and God has appointed a single man and shown that by raising him from the dead. And that's where they get all up in arms. And so they suggest that because of the trials he had as he's in Macedonia and the opposition that he met there and the apparent lack of success that he has in Athens, when he comes to Corinth, he comes with a mindset of depression. Why on earth, God, did you send me here if it's going to be an uphill battle every step of the way? This has been a much more difficult road than he was having when he was ministering on the first missionary journey, where lots of people were hearing him and lots of people were believing. Yes, the Jews raised opposition against him. Yes, there was that little matter of Paul being stoned outside of Lystra and left for dead. But we tend not to remember past crises, but only the ones we are currently and immediately dealing with when we come into difficulties. And so it has been suggested that when Paul comes into Corinth, he's coming with a lot of the wind knocked out of his sails, which is why the vision that he has in verses 9 and 10 is so significant. When Jesus says to him, "Stop being afraid, go on preaching. No one's going to attack you to harm you." Ironically, the very next verse is the Jews attack Paul and bring him before Gallio. They don't harm him. They just they really rise up against him. And we know from reading in First Thessalonians chapter 2 that Paul had sent Timothy to Thessalonica because he was um, frantic with worry, I guess is a good way to put it. First Thessalonians 2, verse 17. But since we were torn away from you, brothers, for a short time in person, not in heart, we endeavored the more eagerly and with great desire to see you face to face, because we wanted to come to you, I, Paul, again and again, but Satan hindered us. For what is our hope, or our crown, or our joy, or our boasting before the Lord Jesus at his coming? Is it not you? For you are our glory and joy. Therefore, when we could bear it no longer, we were willing to be left behind at Athens alone, and we sent Timothy, our brother and God's co worker in the gospel of Christ, to exhort and establish you in the faith. Paul is worried about the church in Thessalonica. He was with them a brief time. Timothy's going to come back, and we read about that in verse 5 of Acts 18. Timothy's going to come back and bring a tremendous report, and it's really going to buoy Paul's spirits up. So, why Corinth? Corinth is, there are the two most important cities that Paul visits in his missionary journeys are Corinth and Ephesus. We can know this both because of the cities themselves, but by the amount of time that Paul spends there. Paul spends a year and a half in Corinth. You heard me when I read that in whatever verse it was, chapter 18, verse 11. And he stays in Ephesus for 2 years, and we know that from Acts 19 and verse 10. Corinth was founded maybe-ish in the 8th century BC, so more than 800 years before the birth of Jesus. It quickly became a prosperous city-state. If you have a Bible atlas and you look at a map, and I didn't mark it in this one, so I'm not going to be able to find it oh, look at that. I opened right up to it. If you look at a map that shows you Greece and you have Athens there, there's a little body of water there's a little bay to the west of Athens. Corinth is on the north side of that bay, so it's not a very long journey from Athens into Corinth. And because there is that bay, it became a natural place for ship trading routes to come through because the waters are calm. You've got deep harborage or deep anchorage there. And Corinth became a very prosperous city-state very quickly. It rose to its height in power between the 7th and 6th centuries BC, when the population of Corinth was estimated to be 200,000 free men. And on top of that, another 500,000 slaves. So nearing 1 million people. Very large, very prosperous city. In 338 BC, when Philip II of Macedon, was making war on everybody south of Macedonia, he captured the city of Corinth and turned it into the center, or the capital city of his league of cities, his little alliance of cities that he made, Philip being the father of Alexander the Great. And so Corinth enjoyed that position of prominence all throughout Alexander's campaign. In 196 BC, the Roman Empire captured Corinth and declared it to be a free city. They recognized the significance of Corinth, and because Corinth wasn't a military power, they were an economic power. So they didn't put up much resistance when Rome came knocking on the gates and said, "Hey, we're here to capture you." So they made Corinth a free city. However, in 146 BC, that Achaean city league, the league of cities that Philip had formed, they revolted against Rome. If you know anything about how Rome handles revolts and rebellions, Rome responded in kind, and the Roman general Lucius Mummius leveled Corinth to the ground and sold the entire population into slavery. The city remained in ruins for about 100 years until in 46 BC, Julius Caesar decreed that the city should be rebuilt. And so Corinth was rebuilt at the command of Julius. It was refounded. This time it was founded as a Roman colony. Now, if you remember in Acts 16, let's see, we are looking in verse 12 of Acts 16. From there, they went to Philippi, which is a leading city of the district of Macedonia and a Roman colony. And we talked a little bit about what that meant. A Roman colony is sort of like a citywide version of an embassy. If you go to the American embassy when you are in Spain, when you are inside that embassy, you are on American soil. It's considered to be a part of the United States of America. It's governed by the laws of the United States of America and is sovereign from and separate from the government of the Spanish people. And so a Roman colony is that way. It is a piece of Rome in another place that isn't Rome. It's governed by Roman administrators. It is free from the poll tax and the uh, provincial taxes that Rome levies against other cities because it's part of Rome. Rome doesn't tax Rome. Rome is taxing the people outside of Rome. And so it becomes a Roman colony. And 27 BC, Corinth became the capital of the Roman province of Achaia. So once again, Corinth has risen in prominence. And this, I believe, is why Paul goes to Corinth, because it is a capital city. He encountered some success in Philippi. Maybe he will encounter similar success in Corinth. The population of Corinth, by around the time of Paul's visit, is estimated to be around 200,000 people. So a good 10 times more than what you're going to find in Athens, or maybe 20 times more than you find in Athens, because the population of Athens was fairly minimal. The population consisted of Greeks, of freed men from Italy, Roman army veterans. There are governmental officials there. There are people from Palestine there. And there was a substantial Jewish community in Corinth. They're an awful long way from Jerusalem, but there were a large number of Jews in Corinth. As I mentioned, Corinth was on multiple land and sea trade routes, so it is a very wealthy city. But possibly when you think of Corinth, if you have studied much of the ancient Near East, you think of how immoral a city it was. Corinth was known for, it was infamous for how immoral a city it was. From beginning in the 5th century BC, the Greek verb that means to Corinthianize meant to act immorally. And you can find that term used in extra biblical writings to refer to the sexual immorality that went on in Corinth. And that reputation continued and was still well deserved in Paul's time when Paul was visiting. Corinth was the center of worship for the goddess Aphrodite. Aphrodite is a goddess of love, lust, pleasure, procreation, um, the, the the pleasures of the flesh. And the temple, the big temple of Aphrodite, was up at the top of the Acrocorinth, the large acropolis that overlooked the Bay of Corinth, um, about 1,800 feet, 18 or 1,900 feet up that hill. And it is said in extra biblical writings that there were 1,000 sacred temple prostitutes who would nightly come down the hill into the city and pursue their profession, let's say, without getting too graphic. So this is what's going on in the time that Paul visits there. There was also a temple of Melicertes or Melkart, who was the god of the sailors. It was at the base of that hill. There were temples to Apollo and one of the gods of healings um, within the city. So the city was rife with idol worship, rife with pagan worship, and is a hotbed of immorality. And here goes Paul into the midst of this setting, possibly because he knows there's a large Jewish community there. And he's going to start, as he always does, with reasoning with the Jews. Every 2 years, the Hellenic Isthmus, that Grecian peninsula, hosted games, sort of a mini Olympics, if you will. Those games were held in Corinth every 2 years, and they drew tremendous amount of visitors who would come to the city. And when they came to the city, they would fill up the areas of lodging very quickly. And so when they needed to have a place to stay, a very convenient thing to do would be to camp outside of the city. When you go camping outside of the city, you need a shelter of some sort. And so the tent trade prospered in Corinth. And here's Paul, a tent maker, just happens to come to a city where tents sell fairly well. Purely a coincidence, right? Or maybe God is doing some directing and stirring of the pot, as we might say. So Acts 18, verses 1 through 17, as I said, we're going to spend at least 2 weeks looking at this. We're only looking at the first 4 verses tonight, where Paul gets settled. It breaks into four brief vignettes that Luke is showing us. The first 4 verses, Paul gets settled. He's going to meet Priscilla and Aquila. They're going to set up shop, and he's going to begin his ministry in the synagogue. In verses 5 through 8, Paul is going to go full time in evangelism because Silas and Timothy return. They're coming with gifts from Philippi, gifts from Thessalonica, and Paul is now, he doesn't have to work anymore, so he can devote himself full time to the gospel. The Jews are going to resist his message. Paul is going to turn to the Gentiles, and many are going to believe, including some of the Jews and including the leader in the synagogue himself, which is kind of interesting that there's a large contingent of unbelieving Jews. Leaders of synagogues got to be that way because they were fairly learned men. They knew scriptures well, and they were generally the oldest. I don't know if it says something about those who are older that who are who are closer to death, that they are more willing to grasp onto a message of salvation than the young people who still are in the bloom of immortality in their life. I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there as a possibility. Verses 9 through 11, Paul is going to receive a much needed vision from Jesus. He's going to say, don't be afraid. You will not be harmed. I have many people here. As a result, Paul stays for a year and a half. And finally, in verses 12 to 17, the Jews are going to bring a charge against Paul. They bring him to Gallio and make a vague argument. I mean, you look at the charge they bring. It's very inspecific. If you read the charges that were brought against Paul in Thessalonica, they specifically said, this man is proclaiming another king besides Caesar. You need to do something about that. No mention of that's made here. The Jews have to be very careful in how they word their argument before Gallio. And we'll talk about Gallio when we get there. Gallio was noted for being perceptive, let's say. He was noted as being a wise man. Granted, it's his brother who is mostly tooting his Gallio's horn, but Gallio was held in high esteem by other Roman governmental officials, and he makes a very astute judgment. He dismisses them, and the Jews try to persuade him by other means, and it fails. There are three significant pronouncements made here in these 17 verses. The first one in verse 6 is when Paul says to the Jews, your blood be on your own heads. That's Paul saying, I'm quits with you. I'm going to the Gentiles. I did my due diligence by you, and I can go to the Gentiles with a clear conscience and preach the word to them. Second, the second pronouncement comes from Jesus in verses 9 through 10 when he says, don't be afraid. And Paul probably needed to hear that. There are times in any ministry where frustration can set in and we can get burned out and we can get close to giving up. Because face it, ministry is difficult. There is no ministry that's just a simple bed of roses where everybody you mention the word Jesus to says, oh, I want to hear about him. Please take me to the baptistry now. And they become immediate faithful Christians and go out and found churches. Ministry doesn't work that way. Ministry is difficult. We have an enemy that is in active opposition to us. And he's been at it a long, long time. And he knows how to harden people's hearts. The third pronouncement is the one from Gallio in verses 14 to 15, where he says, I refuse to be a judge of your own laws. So, with all that introduction, all 25 minutes of it, let's actually get into the four verses that I wanted to talk about. We've already addressed verse 1. Paul comes to Corinth. Leaves us 3 verses. Should be a piece of cake, right? Let's see. Verse 2, he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla. Priscilla and Aquila, as they are most frequently referred to, usually Priscilla is mentioned before her husband. Priscilla is the diminutive form, which I find ironic because it's a diminutive form of a shorter name, the name Prisca. If you look in 1 Corinthians 16, verse 9, Paul, when he is writing about his companions, especially if they're Roman citizens, uses their Roman names. 1 Corinthians 16, verse 19, the churches of Asia send you greetings. Aquila and Prisca, together with the church in their house, send you hearty greetings in the Lord. 2 Timothy 4 and verse 19 is another reference to them. Greet Prisca and Aquila and the household of Onesiphorus. Another example is when Paul is with Silas and he writes the letters to Thessalonica. If you look in 1 Thessalonians 1:1 and 2 Thessalonians 1:1, the letters start Paul, Silvanus, and Timothy to the saints in Thessalonica, or however he addresses them. He calls Silas by his Roman name,. Paul is very formal in his writing. especially when he is writing to Greek churches. And he's accentuating the fact that, hey, these people are people that you need to pay attention to. They are people of some significance. But Priscilla is frequently mentioned before her husband, which leads some to believe that she was more prominent in the church than Aquila, that she was more outspoken and she was more involved in the ministry. Another and perhaps better reasoning is that she may have been of higher status than her husband. Social status meant an awful lot more in the first century than it does to us. I'm not saying the social status doesn't mean anything in the 21st century in the United States. We recognize social statuses of some people. In the first century, everybody knew where everybody else fell in the pecking order. You knew where you stood in rank to the person on your right hand and the person on your left hand. Aquila may have been a freed slave, so he may have had a much lower social standing. We're told that he is a native of Pontus, which is a city in Bithynia, which we read about in Acts chapter 16, verse 7, when Paul wanted to go to Bithynia, but was prevented from doing so. But in either case, why ever Priscilla is mentioned before her husband, they became extremely valued co-workers for Paul. Look in Romans chapter 16, verses 3 and 4, where Paul talks of them. Romans 16, at the end of the book of Romans, not the beginning. Romans 16, verse 3. Greet Prisca and Aquila, my fellow workers in Christ Jesus, who risked their necks for my life, to whom not only I give thanks, but all the churches of the Gentiles give thanks as well. Greet also the church in their house, and greet my beloved Epaenetus, who is a first convert in Asia. But they become valued co-workers with Paul. And I think Paul begins his ministry starting where they may have already begun. We're told here that he meets these two because they had recently come from Italy, because Claudius commanded the Jews to leave Rome. We talked about this a little bit when we were in Acts chapter 16, verses 19 to 40, with Paul being hauled before the authorities in Philippi. Claudius had driven the Jews out of Rome sometime between January of AD 49 and August of AD 52, which was the time that he was in office as emperor, or at least the time when Suetonius puts this in his writings. And Suetonius, Roman historian, and one other that I mentioned back when we were talking about this in Acts chapter 16, wrote that Claudius had expelled the Jews from Rome due to the instigation concerning Chrestus, or the instigation of Chrestus. And there's a couple of suggestions about Chrestus. One is that it's the name of a man. It was a fairly common name, actually, and it could have been an instigator, a fomenter of rebellion among the Jews who was living in Rome at the time. And Claudius's solution to putting down Jewish rebellion was simply get out of Dodge, everybody leave. Or it could be that the historian who doesn't know Christ is using this as a form of the name Christ, a form of the word Christ, the Messiah, the disruption that arose among the Jews over the Christ. And that fits time-wise with the founding of the church in Jerusalem, when we're told in Acts chapter 2, verse not 11, 10, when they're asking, how are we hearing the wonders of God being declared in our own languages? We're told that of from those regions. There were people from Egypt, parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome. It may very well be that Priscilla and Aquila were among those visitors from Rome because it seems that they were Christians before they came to Corinth from Rome. And it may have been that when the word of the Messiah was carried back to Rome, some believed, but as we've seen by example, every time Paul goes and teaches, talks to the Jews about Jesus of Nazareth being the Messiah of God, some believe, some sharply do not believe, and they resist. And so their internal squabble over the validity of Jesus Christ being the Messiah may have come to the attention of the Roman officials. They don't want to be a judge over the Jews and their disputes over their own laws, just as Gallio doesn't here in Acts chapter 18. And so again, Claudius's solution is get out because of the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. The Romans took the peace of Rome very, very seriously. You were going to be a peaceful citizen, or else the Romans would come along and point out to you sharply why you should be a peaceful citizen. And if you did not get the message, they would increase the sharpness until your head fell off, and then you'd become very peaceful and no longer be a trouble to them. The Romans enforced that peace and said that the citizens within the Roman Empire at large should live at peace. They should have peace. Rome was a military power and they held that hammer over your head, but they were reluctant to use it. They didn't want to beat their subjects into submission. They wanted you to see, oh, we benefit greatly from the overlordship of Rome. We're able to go about our daily lives without people interfering with us. We have to pay taxes, but hey, we had to pay taxes anyway under any government. And here they leave us alone and let us do what we want to do, as long as we don't stir up trouble. So it may be that this is why Claudius drove them out of town. But I see the hand of God in this. Because if Claudius had not driven the Jews out of Rome, Priscilla and Aquila would have stayed there. And they would not have come to Corinth, where Paul conveniently meets them, and they conveniently happen to share a trade, so that Paul can actually get established with a foothold in this city where he's going to be for a very long time. I think it's an example of the providence of God who is taking this unfortunate incident where the Jews are driven out of Rome and putting embroidering the silver lining on it and making it useful and beneficial to the spread of the kingdom. So we're told that Paul meets these guys, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade. I have a picture in one of my commentaries of a shop um, in Corinth, in the ruins of Corinth. And there was a large marketplace that was lined with these shops that had roofs and a second story up above. And it was open and sheltered from the elements so that you could go in and do your dealings and trade and business with the people who were in the shops. And there were dozens of them up and down this area. So, like I said, Corinth was a mercantile. They are they're an economic powerhouse. A lot of that econominess, I don't know. Somebody who's smarter with money terms can come up with the right term. Part of that trade and the wealth that's coming in came through these merchant shops because the Romans taxed them. You make the sale, Rome gets their little piece of it. And so Rome's making money, just buckets and buckets of money from the trade that they uh, are engaged in here. And we're told that Paul was, they were tent makers by trade. And this is the first mention and the first use of that word in the New Testament, the idea of them being a tent maker. And this is the first mention that Paul has a trade other than being a Pharisee. And you'd be amazed at how much has been written about Paul the tent maker. Uh, there were there was a study by a fella named Ronald Hock, Paul's Tent Making and the Problem of His Social Class, from the Journal of Biblical Literature in 1978, and a few respondents to it that I didn't read word for word. I read this one almost word for word, but it was a very interesting study of how menial labor was viewed in the first century. The Romans and the Greeks didn't really have a problem with menial labor. In fact, if you were a person who worked with his hands, often you were very proud of the things you did, the things that you made. And you would pay to have little plaques made so that you could stick this thing on. Let's say Mike Hebert is a binder of scrolls, and he would get a little plaque, this thing made by Mike Hebert. Um, Bill says, didn't a Pharisee have enhanced social standing? Yes, he did. But part of the Pharisaic training was when you sat at the feet of these rabbis who were training you, you had to learn a manual trade so that when you went out as an itinerant teacher, you had a means of supporting yourself so that you weren't beholden to the goodwill of the people that you were teaching. And so Paul had become a tent maker at some point, and we're told a few times in his letters, he talks about how he worked, how he labored and worked so that he earned his keep and wasn't a burden to the the church that he was ministering to. In fact, he tells the Corinthians this twice in 1 Corinthians 9, verse 19, and 2 Corinthians 11, verse 7. And one of Hawk's arguments here is that Paul, who has this enhanced social standing as a Pharisee, was entitled to a certain modicum of respect and could expect hospitality by the people that from the people that he was going to teach. But he gave that up. He did not hold on to that. If you remember what he wrote in Philippians chapter 3, when he said, anything that I was before, I consider as rubbish for the sake of knowing Jesus, for the sake of gaining Christ. He chose, and this is my opinion, you study this to see if it fits. He chose to follow in the steps of Jesus. Jesus was known as the carpenter, Mark chapter 6, verse 3, or the carpenter's son, Matthew chapter 13, verse 55. Jesus had a menial trade that he worked at. He was a carpenter. He worked with his hands. Paul is going to urge others to work with their hands too. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 11. 2 Thessalonians 3, verses 10 to 12, and Ephesians chapter 4, verse 28. Paul, as an apostle, also is due a measure of respect because that is a special title. He has been specially chosen. He's been specially picked by God to be the spreader of the word of the kingdom. And so he could go into a town. In fact, that's one of the arguments he makes in First Corinthians. I could have come here and demanded that you give me my daily stipend, or you house me, you feed me, you take care of me. But instead I worked. I labored. I made tents here in this shop with Priscilla and Aquila. following the example of Jesus, who says in Luke chapter 9, verse 58, the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. Jesus did not walk into a village and say, "Here I am, put me up at your best hotel, send a limousine around, and I'll come tour your village, and I'll preach the news of the kingdom." Instead, he humbled himself. Whether he worked at carpentry while he was out on the road, I don't know. None of the gospel writers choose to tell us. Look in Acts chapter 20, verses 33 to 35, when Paul is writing, when he's speaking to the Ephesian elders, said, "I coveted no one's silver or gold or apparel. You yourselves know that these hands ministered to my necessities and to those who were with me. In all these things I have shown you that by working hard in this way we must help the weak, and remember the words of the Lord Jesus and how he himself said, it is more blessed to give than to receive." Paul sought to avoid any hint of covetousness in his ministry by and if you read 1 Corinthians 9, where Paul is saying, you don't muzzle the ox while it's treading out the grain, the worker is worthy of his hire. Paul says, no, that's not the path I chose. I worked so as not to be a burden to you. And Paul was determined to help the weak. He wasn't going to become more of a burden to them. So working in the shop here, he's working in the shop with Priscilla and Aquila. Now, you remember I mentioned those games earlier, those mini Olympic games that people would come to every couple of years. It was very customary, if Bill Moore is there in town to attend the games and while the hotels are filled, he'd go to the local tent maker and say, "Hey, I need lodging. I need a shelter. I'm going to camp outside the city." And so they would take Bill's order. Bill's going to stay there while they're making the tent, and they'll get to talking. What do you suppose Paul talked about with those who were watching him make his tents? He's talking about Jesus. He's preaching. He's using his trade as a tool for his evangelism. Gee, I wonder if those of us who are employed now, can still do that. Can we use the work that we're doing to spread the news of the gospel, to spread the message of the church? And I know some workplaces have restrictions against um, discussing religion. You don't have to stand up on top of your desk and wave your Bible in the air and say, "People, listen to me. Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and he came to forgive you of your sins." We can go in more subtle ways. We can be that example. We can be the one who gives credit to not our skills when a job is well done, but hey, God has enabled me to do this. We can use what we've been given, and we didn't even make it to verse 4. Well, verse 4, real quick. He reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. Paul reasons in Acts chapter 14, verse 1, with Jews and Greeks. In chapter 19, verses 10 and 17, again with Jews and Greeks. And finally, in chapter 20, verse 21, again with the Jews and the Greeks. The Greeks are those God-fearers, not proselytes, but the God-fearers who have attached themselves to the synagogue of the Jews. They come to hear about the God of the Jews because our God is an attractive God. Our God is not a God who has fits of anger like the Greek gods do, and who have to be appeased so that they don't come along and beat you upside the head with a rod and and steal your cattle. The God that we serve is a God of love. He's a God of peace. He's a God of joy. He's a God who desires a relationship with and is eager to bless his people. That's an attractive God when you compare it to some of the Roman gods, some of the Babylonian gods, the Babylonian gods who demanded human sacrifice. Yes, the God of the Hebrews demands sacrifice too, but it's not onerous. You aren't giving him a sacrifice in order that he will bless you. You're giving him a sacrifice because he has already blessed you. And that runs so counter to all the other religions that you will find that God is looking for a thanksgiving offering. Sin offering, yes, but the thanksgiving offering, because he's already blessed you. You're not bringing him a lamb in order to bribe him or something, but in order to say, thank you, Lord, for what you have already done. Next week, we will get into uh, at least verses 5 through 11. I'd like to make it all the way to verse 17, but I'm not going to make any promises. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording there.